Welcome to Church Pulse Weekly. It's Carey Newhoff here, joined once again by Savannah Kimberlin of Barna Group, and we are talking online church and tech. And we have Aussie Dave Adamson, who's going to join us. Let me try that again. Adamson. I can speak English, and he'll be with us in a few minutes. But yeah, we're going to talk about hybrid church, church online, trends in future church attendance, and a whole lot more. And yeah, we get to dive into some of the data, which we have a lot of on this subject. So what are we learning these days, Savannah?
Yes. So glad to be here, Carey. Very excited for this conversation today. We're going to get practical. We're going to talk about digital strategy. So as we're thinking about what church is going to look like after the pandemic, it's always helpful to firstly ground ourselves in people's plans and expectations, right? So I think as church leaders, we can make all the plans in the world, but what are the people thinking? What are they going to do? What are they wanting? And so we have recently gathered some data on this and published it in a wide variety of different books. But I want to start us off today with one data point specifically about people's intent for returning to church. So it's important to know that when we asked back in September of 2020, if people plan to come back to church, what their habits or behaviors were like, 56% of churched adults, so that's the majority, agree that they're waiting for church services to return back to normal before they return. Now, I know what you're thinking, Carey. What does that even mean? Nothing is going to go back to normal.
Yeah, the cynic in me is like, oh, they're not coming back.
Right, exactly. But even as maybe as a conversation starter today for you and Dave, what we need to know that that's where people are at, that the majority of churchgoers are in that state mentally. This is the sentiment that they're carrying. And so that's where we need to lead them from.
Yeah. And there was also, because I track those numbers fairly closely in our partnership with you at Barna on my own website. And I remember there was another stat, like 1 in 5, this was end of the year 2020, of church-going adults have basically just stopped attending any form of church, just gone. And, you know, John Mark Comer has spoken about that the first thing to die in a post-Christian culture is nominal Christianity. Maybe some of that is part of that as well. And then there was a stat early on in the pandemic. It'd be interesting to track that one again in 2021, that half of people had not done any church online after Easter. And then of those who had done church online, 23-ish% were watching other churches. So in other words, yes, I'm still here, but not with you, right? So there's a whole, I talk about that. I think about that as consolidation, like the market is consolidating. Sure. And then I also think of that in terms of loyalties are shifting. Like you think about how many patterns have been disrupted in the last year in your life, from where you work out, how you work out, to where you shop, to how you buy clothes. I mean, I haven't been to a clothing store in a year and a half. And I have lots of new clothes, but now, you know, UPS delivers them to my door and we try them on. If they don't fit, they go back, right? Yeah. Everything's changed. What else are you seeing in the data?
Yeah. So when we're talking about digital strategy, I want to maybe start off the conversation today, challenging us to think innovatively, as just to remind us that it's not the moment to slip into rhythm. We need to continue to innovate and not grow stagnant in that innovation, I think. And so maybe one way that we can consider growing digitally, and we've seen this in the data, is actually through healthy prayer culture digitally. What does it look like to stretch ourselves, to do prayer in a vibrant, really beautiful way digitally that promotes growth? So I bring that to the table because we've actually been exploring that over the past couple of months, because we've seen indicators that churches, it's really interesting that churches that have adopted a healthy prayer culture digitally are actually seeing healthier congregants across the board right now. They're seeing that their congregants are more inclined to say that they're feeling the presence of God when they're engaging with their church digitally. They have more peace. They have a deeper level of connection with their church leaders. There really is something to having healthy prayer culture when we're trying to do hybrid and digital church. So something for our listeners to maybe consider as we continue to plan for the future of digital church.
Well, I think that's a really good point too. And, Barna has been tracking very closely over the last little while, dimensions of human flourishing. So it's not just, how many dollars are people giving? Is attendance up or is it down? It's more like, how are people connected relationally, emotionally, spiritually, those kinds of things, vocationally. Yeah. And all of that is available at barnaaccess.com. But anything else you want to share? Because I want to talk about the collab, and then we're going to bring Dave in. Anything else data-wise?
No, that was it. I think just generally, if you were to ask me, that's enough.
That's a lot to think about.
Yeah. We got to continue to think about the future of the digital church. So those were my 2 data points today to maybe continue that conversation.
No, I appreciate that, Savannah. Yeah. And moving forward, I think the hybrid church is here to stay. I want to talk to Dave about that in a minute, but you're leading a hybrid collab. It's a 6-week learning cohort designed to help you figure out how to lead your church more effectively in both the digital and in-person spaces. None of this is like, hey, there's never going to be an in-person church. No, there's absolutely going to be an in-person church. It's going to be different. And you're going to be online. So you can go to barna.com/collab, that's COLAB. And if you use the promo code ChurchPulse15, because you're a podcast listener, you'll get a discount on that. So Savannah, thanks for joining us so much today. Really appreciate this. And let's bring in Dave Adamson. Dave wears many hats. Many of you know him online as Aussie Dave. And he is currently just started as director of Orange for Australia and New Zealand, and is joining us today at some ungodly hour. I don't know, what time is it there? Is it like a good time or a bad time?
It's pretty early in the morning, but it's okay, Carey. It's always good to see you.
It's always good to see you too. Yeah, I think I've texted you at 2 a.m. by mistake once. But anyway, hopefully you don't sleep with your phone.
You did.
Anyway, hey, any response to the data? I know we shared an awful lot really quickly, but you've been tracking it fairly closely as well.
Yeah.
Anything jump out at you, Dave?
Yeah, like that, what you were talking about at the end about that, how people are doing personally in their life, not just in their faith. I think that was super interesting, because I know I've been talking to church leaders here in Australia, and talking to some ministry leaders, and looking at some of the data here. And, the fact that in Australia, and I'm sure this is the same worldwide, almost 50% of people say that they feel lonely at some point, which is obvious because there's a pandemic going on. We haven't been able to see people, but we're more connected than ever before digitally. And this is particularly prevalent. What I've seen is in the younger generation, like in the 15 to 25-year-olds. Apparently that's where loneliness spikes the highest, which for me, as somebody who's a social media pastor, somebody who is an advocate of online church, that's so, disappointing, frustrating, because these teenagers, these young people have thousands of followers, but they don't feel like they have one friend. And that's something that I think the church needs to address. And we need to get onto that as quick as we can, I think.
Yeah, there are a lot of misconceptions, I guess, about church online. One of the constant pushbacks I get as an advocate for hybrid church or digital church is people assume everything will be virtual. I don't think that's what we're talking about here. That's not what you're talking about, is it?
No, not at all. I always get Hebrews 10 thrown at me, right? Do not give up meeting
let us
together.
Not forsake the most quoted
exactly.
verse. Maybe,
exactly. But it's the most quoted verse out of context, I think, as well, because I don't know of a digital church advocate who would say that we think it should all go digital. It should all go online. I don't think anybody has ever said that. But I think what the pandemic has done is it shifted our thinking a little bit, that gathering, that space where we get together doesn't have to be between 9 a.m. and 11 a.m. on a Sunday morning. We can gather together in small groups in people's homes anytime during the week, and we can access the content digitally. And so move into that Hebrews 10 space, but just not do it inside the church building.
Right. Okay. So you led the digital ministry before your current assignment at North Point for a good number of years, almost arguably got it off the ground into sort of the modern era. What were some of the things that you discovered over, let's say, the last 5 years when you were at North Point that helped bring you the most traction, Dave?
Yeah, great question. So North Point, when I got there, was already doing a very robust job with online church and streaming services. But one of the things we wanted to shift was to create community around the content that we're streaming out. One of the things, we would say in every hosting spot is that we stream the services to give you a window into our church, but also to create a doorway through which you can enter into community. And so for us, one of the things that we got traction with pretty early on, and we tried everything. We tried setting up city groups, what we called city groups. So if people were watching, I don't know, in Anchorage, Alaska, we would try to connect them with each other so that they could start watching it together. And now that meant our analytics showed that the number of URLs watching that service went down, but it meant people were watching together. So we tried that. We tried geo-tagging podcast software so that anybody who was outside the Atlanta area, which is where North Point is, they would get a different podcast intro to the people who are inside the Atlanta church area. So that
you can do that, can you?
Yeah, you can do that. Yeah, there's a great It's called Omni Studio is the software, and it allows you to bookend your intros and outros so that you can geotag it to where people are living. So if you lived outside of Atlanta, you would get an intro from our pastor, Andy Stanley, pushing you to our online services. Whereas if you were inside Atlanta, like inside that, bubble 50-kilometer radius around Atlanta, you would get one that said, hey, we'd love to have you come to one of our churches. So doing those sorts of things was super helpful. I think the thing that stands out that got the most traction was a couple of years ago when we shifted everything across to YouTube and we started to keyword optimize our message titles. That's when we got the most traction, not just putting out stuff onto YouTube. That wasn't the deal. That wasn't the traction maker. What really it was when we started keyword messaging, keyword titling every message that Andy did. So I would go back through the archives and retitle every message, which a very daunting task when, there's so many messages up there already. But what happened was in the first 30 days at some of our churches, we saw a 125% increase in the number of views and viewer retention as well. And it was all based around just keyword titling our messages. So in the digital age, I tell pastors all the time, the way that we used to title our services, with either cliches or, an alliteration of some description, that used to work 25 years ago. It doesn't work now. People are searching Google and searching YouTube for answers to questions, and they need to be able to find those answers in the moment that they need them, and they're finding them on Google and on YouTube.
So let's break that down, because this is fascinating, right? So as a guy who's preached for almost 30 years, like I know you think about the title, you test it with your team, you kind of trot it out. It's kind of there. And you and I have talked about this over the years. We know each other quite well. You've also done some work with my church at Connexus. And literally over the last year, I will title a series something. It'll show up online under a different title. I title my messages. I preached one recently, and like the team changed it. I'm like, I'm not even sure that's what it's about, but okay, I guess if it gets more views. What is going on there? Like, what is wrong with pastors, or what is unstrategic? It's not right or wrong. What is unstrategic about a pastor saying this series is being called X and week one, part one is being called Y, whatever I thought the best title was? What is unstrategic about that?
Yeah, great question. So, and you're right, it's not right or wrong, it's just different, but it's strategic in the way that we can keyword title things for this reason. See, we would have, a pastor might do a series on stepping out in faith, for example, but they might call it Get Out of the Boat. Let's just go with that title.
It's called Out of the Boat. I already know what it's called.
Because we know what, and most Christians listening will know exactly what verse we're going to use and all that sort of thing. But when people are going onto YouTube, especially unchurched people, Carey, they're not typing in, how do I get out of a boat? Unless they literally want to get out of a boat, right?
But if you're preaching to drowning people, right?
Yeah, exactly. But they are asking questions about faith and what does it mean to step out in faith? And so if you just simply called your message on YouTube, how do I step out in faith? Well, that's going to get a lot more views, and that's going to get a lot more viewer retention, because you're literally answering the question that people are typing into that search bar, which is what a keyword title or a keyword phrase is. What is the words that people are actually typing into Google when they're looking for an answer to a question? And here's the big thing about this that makes it strategic. People go to YouTube to find answers for everything from fixing their car to fixing their marriage. And what we need as the church is we need to be in that place in what Google calls the zero moment of truth, or they call it ZMOT for short. Now, this is a salesy thing where companies will pay big money to make sure that their shirt, you were talking about buying clothes earlier, right? When you're searching for clothes online and you're ready to buy a shirt, you've done all the research. Companies pay Google big money to be there in that zero moment of truth when you're ready to hit buy, that buy button that's there. That's the zero moment of truth. But in the church world, Carey, the zero moment of truth is when somebody's typing into Google, how do I save my marriage? How do I be a better dad? How do I find hope in the midst of all of this? How do I stop drinking? How do I stop looking at pornography? That's the zero moment of truth. And if they're typing that in and we've titled our message, How to Get Out of the Boat, like it's not connecting at all. We're not there in that zero moment of truth. And so I think strategically, when it comes to online, and this is where online church becomes online ministry, right? When the pandemic hit, I was coaching so many churches just through how to live stream. Now it's moved to how do I do online ministry? How do I connect with people in their biggest need? And as Savannah just shared, one of the biggest needs is loneliness. One of the biggest needs is just that human interaction. So how do we create opportunities for that don't mean we push everything to online, but actually help us connect with people during the week when they need it the most?
Yeah. So just to get even a little bit nerdier, how do I know what people are typing into Google? How do I know what people are? Because YouTube is the second largest search engine in the world. True or rumor?
Yes.
Okay.
100%.
So if somebody is there going, how do I get a relationship with God? Or how do I pray? Or I want to save my marriage. How do I know what are the right keywords?
Yeah, so there's a number of different ways you can do it. The first one is, and everybody's already done this. I guarantee everybody who's listening or watching this podcast has already done this themselves. When you go to Google and you start typing in, for example, Carey, let's be honest, it's probably something like, how do I get my Alexa to make all my lights go on when I want it to? It might be something really mundane, but as soon as we start to type in, how do I, Google will preempt the most popular searches that start with that phrase. That's the Google suggests. That's the best. Google suggests it's the best and easiest and cheapest, honestly, way to do that. So if you start typing in the topic, what is the topic of your message for that week? And then start typing that into Google, whatever pops up, that might be, and there's a number of suggestions, right? And they rank in order. That's probably some good ideas for how you should title your message. Another thing you can do is there are applications like keyword application and keyword search applications like Morning Fame, which is one that I use. It's like $15 a month, and it will do a comprehensive what's called a long tail search of your content title and give you the absolute best score for a keyword phrase that people are actually searching for. So that, something like Morning Fame costs about $15. Then there's other YouTube keyword optimizing tools that cost anywhere up to $50 a month that you can use. But the cheapest and freest way is just to use the tool that Google already gave us with the built-in Google Suggest.
Great. So North Point obviously has a lot of staff. You have a lot of expertise in this area. This was your full-time job. The average church leader listening to this is solo, or they have two people on their team. They're not 22 years old. They didn't grow up digital native. What would you say to that leader who is like, man, that sounds awesome. How do I even know if I'm getting it right? Like I typed in this thing, I changed my message title, 4 people watched the message. What is it, the advice I often give, and feel free to correct me, is find somebody between 15 and 25 on your team and deputize them as a volunteer. They're pretty quick students. Is that good advice? Like what is good advice if you don't have staff?
Yeah, I think that is great advice. 100% great advice, because digital natives are going to get this a little bit easier. And I personally, and you and I have talked about this before, I lean heavily into my 3 daughters because they're 17, 18, and 20. And so if they tell me some stuff that's happening at the moment, that really guides me in what I'm thinking through. But I think the idea of it is that when it comes to the message title specifically, which is the topic we're talking about, steer away from just the way that you used to do things and just start titling your messages the answers to questions that people are actually asking in your community. And I think as pastors, especially local pastors in a local community, we know what the top 5 human needs are for the people who are in our community. You know, there are some things that are cross-cultural. We all, you know, I think if we're married, we all want to be better spouses. We all want to be successful in our careers. We all want to make sure that we're being good parents if we're parents. We all want to be better at managing our money. There are some certain things that are just natural human topics. Start building series around those and start explaining to people what the Bible says about the answers to those questions that they're asking. And then you can also just do some Google searches. What are the top Google search questions right now? If you Google that, there's the rest of 2021 series titles taken care of right there. You can just write messages around the questions that people are actually asking. And that's free. You know, it doesn't cost us anything to be able to do that. Outside of that, if I could give this piece of advice, you know, I remember early on, about this time last year, very early into the pandemic, I got a phone call from a pastor in Texas. I was in Atlanta at the time, and he had some questions around YouTube Live. And his questions were, he had been posting his message, you know, 35-minute messages to YouTube for about a year and a half. And then during the pandemic, when it hit, he was taking his dog for a walk. And he decided just to get on YouTube Live and do a live stream to YouTube. So he just did it from his phone, completely free, while he's walking his dog. And all he said was, hey, if you're lonely today, or if you need prayer today, I just want to pray for you over the next 20 minutes while I'm walking my dog. So just let me know in a comment what I can pray for you about. And then he literally just prayed for people. He contacted me about a week later and said, hey, I normally get 200 views on my messages, but that live video, got 18,000 views. Why would I ever post a message again? Why don't I just keep doing this? And I said to him, that's because you are meeting the needs of the people who are around you in that moment. And that's what they needed the most. That was that zero moment of truth. I need prayer right now because my marriage is falling apart. I need prayer right now because I need a new job, or I'm unemployed, or I don't have enough money to pay the bills. And he was able to answer those questions for people right in that live moment. I'm not surprised it got 18,000 views. So you don't have to have a big production. You don't have to do that. I'm not an advocate for huge production, even though I know it looks like it because I've got a good set here and everything. But going on your phone that you've already got in your pocket, I think pastors need to know, Carey, people carry around a pulpit, a giving collection plate, and a worship team in their pocket every day. All we need to do is get on there, and that can happen really simply and really easily.
Is there a room? I appreciate you saying that too, because I've answered, like, you have a million gear questions over the last year. And I always go minimalism, right? It's even, you know, the studio looks nice and everything, but there's not, like, I haven't spent thousands on lights or cameras or anything like that. And I don't think you need to really make a difference. What do you think, in talking to leaders, have been some of the fears around online? Because I saw a lot of experimentation in the early days of coronavirus, where people were on all the time doing stuff like the pastor you just talked about. And now all of a sudden it's like, join our live stream. And there's not a lot of innovation anymore. What do you think some of the hesitancies are around people's reluctance to experiment?
Well, yeah, I don't know what the reluctance is to experiment. I mean, this is the best time possible to experiment. As my old boss, Andy Stanley, used to say, don't let a good pandemic go to waste, right? This is the time to innovate. This is the time to change things up. But I think the overriding fear is twofold. Obviously, there is the gear question. Do I have the right gear to go online? Can I even do that? I always tell people, you've got a smartphone and you've got a window. So the lighting, the audio, and the video is all taken care of. If that's all you use, people will lean into your authenticity more than they'll lean into how awesome your gear is. So we need to step away from that. But then we need to start leveraging, I think, the online ministry aspect of online church. And I think sometimes this gets overlooked because we get so bogged down in the gear stuff that we forget the ministry stuff. And I always go back to just the example that the Apostle Paul gives. Paul used the technology of his day to connect people with each other and connect people with God. The technology of his day, letter writing. If you're watching and you're under 20, letter writing is when you take a pencil and you push it down onto pieces of paper. That's writing. That was the technology of Paul's day, right?
Yeah.
Churches and pastors today need to do exactly the same thing. We need to leverage the technology of our day to connect people with God and connect people with each other. The technology of our day is Instagram, it's YouTube, it's TikTok, it's Clubhouse. How are we using these tools to connect people with God and connect people with each other? And really all it is it's telling a first century message with a 21st century method. That's all we're really doing. We're not changing the message. We're just changing our method. We're innovating our method of how people can connect with God and connect with each other. And in that way, I really think the first century model becomes more applicable and becomes more achievable, Carey. Because if you think about it, Jesus' disciples followed him around 24/7 for 3 full years. They didn't just show up on Sundays between 9 and 10 and then leave and never have connection with him for the rest of the week, right? To be discipled, they had to be with him constantly. Well, we have the opportunity to do that right now. This is the first time in human history, we can literally go around the whole world in an instant because of the technology available to us. So we need to, I think if we're getting bogged down by the gear question, we need to start leaning into the discipleship, into the ministry side of things. And you'll see that it will start to bring, I think it starts to bring new life to pastors because they see that they're having an ongoing connection, ongoing engagement, and they're actually growing their local church community. I think too often what happens is we think we have to be the next Andy Stanley, the next Craig Groeschel, the next Karen Newhoff with a worldwide platform, right? But the reality is, the people in your community where you're called to serve in your local church, they need you to be there for them in the most clear, compelling way possible. And often that's happening online.
So you said something at the very beginning, which kind of brought back a memory for me. North Point has been online for a long time. And I went back.
Yeah.
I'm going to date myself here. I think it was 2002, 2003. Andy did a series called Heroes, which I watched on, primitive internet, barely dial-up video back in 2003. And that was one of my first exposures to, and a few years later, I'd meet him and we become partners and the whole deal. But I remember that was a first connection. And you talked about, and I've talked to Susie Gray, who is definitely worth following at North Point as well. You know, Susie.
For sure.
Between the whole Your Move platform, the podcast. I mean, Andy's content gets accessed millions of times a month.
Yeah.
But you were trying for years now to connect people in different cities. So you geotag them, you'd find all the people who are watching in Tucson or Seattle. You try to connect them. Why don't you watch together? That's what is now emerging out of this pandemic as a possibility of microchurch. And small churches have that potential now too. Before it was mega churches, but I've talked to so many normal sized church people. That's what's happening to them. They have members, they're located in the Midwest, but they have people in Pittsburgh watching, or they're located in Toronto, but they have people in England watching. And what were some keys? Like, was that successful connecting those people? How does that work? Any thoughts on people thinking about micro church, micro gatherings, micro campuses?
Yeah. So we actually moved a lot of people into small groups in their cities for a certain period of time. But I think we probably we attempted that maybe too early. Sometimes we were rushing too fast on the innovation, and I'm certainly guilty of that. And so then it falls by the wayside. And there's a I look back and there's just all these broken down things that were good now, but back at the time when we were doing it, it wasn't, the things weren't ready for it. Systems weren't ready for it. But now, yes, I would say this is the time to be doing that. One of the things I've been seeing, and one of the things I've been saying a lot is I think the era of the mega church is over. Like, I think that's not going to happen anymore, because churches need to focus on building community around their content. And the idea of somebody watching a service online and then going to a small group during the week to have that gathering, that Hebrews 10 moment, that scales way more than a single service inside a building. And so I think the churches that are getting this right, and you alluded to it with Andy specifically, and the Your Move content, what Andy does really well and what North Point does really well is we repurpose on purpose. We repurpose all of Andy's content on purpose. So the content that goes out onto the Your Move TV show on NBC on Saturday nights is the message from Sunday, but it's a cut down version of that message to fit within a 22-minute 22-minute format. But then we don't just put it out for that. We also take that message and we chop it down to a 2-minute message. We edit it down to just one point in 2 minutes that we push out onto social media. And that social media post has links to a 7-minute version of the same message on YouTube, which has YouTube cards and YouTube descriptions and a YouTube end screen that pushes people to the 35-minute full version of the message. So we're walking people through steps. And the idea behind that is you just need to lower the bottom rung on the digital invitation ladder. You lower the bottom rung on that invitation ladder, because the reality is, if I go over to my neighbor and my neighbor says, hey, I'm struggling with my marriage at the moment, and I pull out my phone and I say, hey, do you want to watch a 35-minute message my pastor did on marriage on my phone with me? That's like the equivalent of saying to somebody, hey, I know you don't like church, but if I buy you lunch after church, will you please come with me, right? Yeah. We have to lower the bottom rung on that. And so if we can take that 35-minute piece of content and trim it down and apply that, post that to certain specific platforms designed for the length of the video, that's when it starts to have a win. That's when we start walking people through steps of faith that lead to them ultimately, when everybody is back into their church buildings and things like that, maybe they'll start coming to church as well. I truly believe, Carey, there's going to be a point where at North Point, where I was for 7 years, I think that somebody's going to get up one day at church on Sunday and say, hey, I'm here today because I started my faith journey by watching an Instagram video of a message that Andy did. And then I watched a 7-minute version of that message on YouTube. And that led to me watching a full message and then a full series. And then I couldn't help but watch the service online. And so then I started coming to church and I found Jesus. I think that's the steps of faith that people are going to be taking in the modern world.
You said something really big that I can't let just pass by. You said the era of the mega church is over. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? It's a big statement.
Yeah, I know. And I know it's a big statement, especially from somebody. I'm not anti-mega church. No, I mean,
you've worked at several.
I've worked at several. And I love the reach, like the mega church pastor like Andy Stanley has, not just on me, but on my unchurched friends and my church friends here in Australia as well. So I think that process is fantastic. So I'm not against mega churches. I just think the reality is that even pre-pandemic, even pre-COVID, we all know that church attendance wasn't what it used to be. Even people who went to church had stopped going to church. And I've been saying for a while, and I remember having a conversation with Andy about this about 4 years ago, that church attendance is not decreasing, it's decentralizing. People are watching his content. They're just watching it across multiple channels now. So they might come to church one week of the month, then the next week they listen on podcast. The next week after that, they watch video on demand on YouTube. And then the week after that, they might catch it midweek, on a 7-minute version of the message on YouTube, but they're always going to their small groups. And so the church attendance was decentralizing away from that main core hub of that building, but people were still accessing the content. And so I think moving forward, as I said, the idea of a church putting out content and letting people watch that and access that digitally, and then having a system in place where they can go and talk about that content in community, in their neighborhood, for example, I think that scales way more than just a big church building. Now, I think there are still going to be church buildings and there's still going to be churches. I just think people will be taking fewer steps inside the church building moving forward. They will access content, podcast, they'll access it on YouTube, they'll access it on video on demand, and then they'll have community in their local neighborhoods, their local communities.
Right. Let's talk about
what are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts?
Oh, yeah.
Right,
well,
wrong?
It's not my podcast, but yeah, I agree. I mean, we have seen this. I mean, the Barna charts go back years. Like there's this one chart I've used in some of my writing. The pre-pandemic, the 20-year church attendance trend was down. And some of that was frequency and decentralization. Some of it was, post-modernity. And I think there's almost everybody who would tell you it was unless you were brand new, or charismatic churches were seeing some growth charismatic expression, not necessarily theology, but that kind of experience was seeing some momentum, but momentum was just harder long before the pandemic hit. And now that we're a year into this, I think what Craig Rochelle said on this podcast a few months ago is absolutely true, that, people's habits have shifted. His 20 or 30 year habit of working out, this one guy at this one gym just died during the pandemic. It's probably not coming back. And so I think we're going to be disrupted. So I don't disagree. And I don't think that doesn't mean the church is dead. It just means those of us who love full rooms have to start thinking beyond the room. And
that's really key,
rooms.
right?
I do.
And isn't that a big shift though? That's such a big dramatic shift for us who like talking in front of a lot of people on stage and like having full rooms, or worship leaders who like seeing all the hands up in the air. But I just think that's going to happen less and less, because we've moved into, the whole world is an on-demand world now. We all watch video on demand. And what that means is people want, that goes back to that zero moment of truth. When I'm feeling lonely, I want to search, how do I overcome my loneliness, or how do I find hope? And I want to watch that content, and it happens to be on a Wednesday. Unfortunately, I think for a lot of church leaders, the on-demand that they think of is that they demand people to come to their church building, to a certain place at a certain time of the week to access their content. And that's not the reality of the world anymore.
Yeah, nobody's sitting around on Thursday night at 9:00 waiting for the latest Office to drop. I mean, if you want to watch The Office, you just go watch The Office, right?
Yeah, if you want to watch Ted Lasso, right? Ted Lasso, great show. We binge watch that multiple times now, but we watch it on demand, and we watch it what we want, when we want to watch it. And I think that's why I think that mega church idea, I don't think it's going to be happening anymore once the world's quote unquote gets back to normal. I just don't think we can go back to that model anymore, because people, their habits have shifted, their tastes have shifted, their needs have shifted as well. And I think the churches that are going to survive and thrive in the next season will be those that have a robust small group system, that understood before COVID that circles were better than rows, that what people do in circles during the week is better than whether or not they're sitting in a row with you. Because I think rows are going to become more and more empty as people watch more and more on demand, listen more and more on podcast, and then get together in small groups during the week to have that Hebrews 10 moment.
So one of the fun things about talking to people in Australia is you literally are in tomorrow, so you can tell me what tomorrow's like, right? Which is always fun. But there's a certain sense in which that's even more true, Dave, because you guys handled the pandemic differently than in North America or even parts of Europe.
Oh, yeah.
In the sense that lockdown was fast, brutal, tight, and you're relatively open now, correct? Do you have to wear a mask when you leave the house by law still, or are you moving
No,
into that?
I moved. My family and I moved back to Australia in November, and I honestly have not worn a mask since we got out of 2 weeks mandatory quarantine. Not worn a mask since. Malls are pretty full. Restaurants are pretty full. Churches are about 85% full from what I can see. 85% of people have returned. But there is a really robust contact tracing system in place in Australia, where everybody who comes in scans a QR code, whether you're going to the movies, whether you're going to a restaurant, or whether you're going to church. You scan a QR code so that the government knows where you were. So if there isn't, a COVID case pops up, they can track everybody who was in that vicinity. I think it's been interesting for me, Carey, moving back here. I spent 13 years living in the US, and spent the first year of the pandemic in the US and watched the US culture. And what I've learned is that American culture is really focused on personal freedom, whereas Australian culture is more focused on community safety. And that's not a value statement. That's not a value statement either way. One's not right, one's not wrong. They're just very different. And we've had the opportunity to live and experience both of those things. So our personal freedom is somewhat taken away when there's a really harsh, heavy lockdown and you're not allowed out within 5 kilometers of your home without a really good reason for it. But what happens is those lockdowns are short and sharp. They call it a circuit breaker. If there's a 3 people who get coronavirus in a community, they have a circuit breaker 3-day lockdown, then life goes back to normal again, because we addressed the community safety issue and then we moved on from that. So yeah, it's been interesting to be here and see how the church has responded to that too.
Yeah. So you're saying it's about 85% of regular attendance. And my studies would be much less scientific. We don't have full data for 2021. But what I'm hearing anecdotally from a broader swath of church leaders in North America is on the low side, depending on where you are, it's 15 to 30% of former pre-COVID church attendance, to more average 30 to 40. Some are starting to see 50, 60% now if you're in a pretty open state. But very few. In fact, I can't think of anybody who's seen 100% of what they used to see prior to COVID. I'd love your thoughts, like that gap of 15%. Is there a difference between model of church and what people are seeing? Like, what about the big church versus the small church? What can you nuance that a little bit?
Yeah. So when I say 85%, let me be really super clear with this. I live in a state of Australia that has been particularly has done a particularly good job in handling COVID. And I live in a region of that state that has been even better at managing COVID. Right. And so that 85% is, like, I would say probably from a worldwide COVID point of view, this area that I live, which is the Sunshine Coast, is probably ahead of most places in the world. I mean, I don't think we've had a case here in like 6 to 9 months, something along those lines, in this part of the world. So they had a strong lockdown. It feels very safe, and it feels like it's surreal for somebody who came from the US just recently. It feels almost surreal to be here because it's like a post-COVID world in this part of where I am. And so they're experiencing the 85%. I would say from speaking with a bunch of church leaders around Australia, they're probably more at the 60% sort of rate, especially in major cities like Sydney and Melbourne, where the population is more dense. They're probably about that 60% rate, but here 85%. And the churches that I see that are doing a great job with getting people to come back, they have two things in common, I think. The first one is that they're prioritizing community time. The church that my wife and I and our family have started to become part of, they literally, every service at evening starts at 6 o'clock, but people start showing up at 5, and they have this outdoor cafeteria. They move it all outdoors. They have tables everywhere, and people sit down and just talk and connect with other human beings face to face for an hour before church stuff starts. The music will start and people will start to wander in at some point, but the church does not want to close down that opportunity for people to have face-to-face connection. So that's the first thing. Allowing space and room for that to happen safely has been a key for the churches that I think are doing really, really well with it. And that's why they're at 85%. The other part of it is the churches that are doing well have a really robust small group strategy or system already in place. So people are already connecting locally in their church communities, in their neighborhoods, in their small groups. And so that community is really, really strong. And they've already prioritized what I said earlier, that circles are better than rows in their church. And if people had to choose, the leadership of the church would say, hey, we want you to choose meeting together in circles rather than coming on Sundays to sit in a row. And so that communication has really led to them being so far ahead, I think, in the post-COVID world as well.
So that's encouraging to hear that there are some churches that are prioritizing, community, and that kind of makes sense. The thing you can't get online. Are there some models of church or approaches to church that you've seen, generally speaking, that are struggling a little bit more? What about the big church, the big experience? Come to the show. Like, are those churches doing well, or are they struggling more? What do you see?
Yeah, I've had the chance to go to a couple of, like you said, charismatic churches with a charismatic expression. And those churches seem to be less full. And I think part of that is because so much is reliant on everything being so vocal. You know what I mean? People responding during the message, people singing really loud. And science has told us that those are things that can spread the pandemic. Some of those churches have done a really good job. They do what they call, when you go to like a special cinema and it's gold class seating where you get the bigger chairs, they call it gold class seating in their church. So they've removed the pews and the rows, and they've just created clusters of seating. So I've seen that seems to work really, really well. But, I've also spoken to church leaders who have said, hey, we are just really hanging on until everything, quote unquote, goes back to normal. And then we can just open our church buildings and we can shut down the online experience. And I think those churches are always going to struggle when life does go back to some sort of normalcy, because they're not doing that hybrid model that you're talking about right at the top of the podcast. Right. They're not doing that. What you call it hybrid, I call it omni-channel approach, where everything that they're doing online interconnects and is woven so perfectly into what they experience physically as well, that really they're both an expression of each other. So it's not multi-channel anymore. It's omni-channel, where they are interconnected and locked together. Those churches I think will do well, but the churches that are just waiting, we want to open up fully in person so we can close down online, I think they're going to really struggle.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Look ahead a couple of years. Nobody has a perfect answer to this question, right? If I would have looked ahead a year ago and said, what's March 2021 going to be like? I'd be like, world will be back to normal. Everything will be great. Wrong. So we're all thinking in pencil here, but what are your predictions longer term in whatever normalcy emerges for in-person church attendance, hybrid church? What would you be planning for?
I think those churches that are doing the small group system really, really well, that have already built up a model and a system where their church members are already connected in small groups in their local community, I think they're the ones that are going to do absolutely the best. I also think those churches that are thinking ahead already to how they can repurpose their content to lower the bottom rung of the digital invitation ladder and get people connected digitally, I think they're going to do super well. Also, that would be my next thing. And then what I said right at the top, Carey, I think the conversation we had about keyword titling and that zero moment of truth, if churches can get their head around that right now, and now's the time to be doing it, get your head around repurposing your message titles so that they're keyword optimized, and then posting those things to YouTube, but using YouTube not just as a video storage facility like we used to with Vimeo, using it for what you said it is, the second biggest search engine in the world. So make it easy for people to find your content. If churches can get those things in place now, and they don't cost a lot of money and they don't take a lot of resources, it's just retitling some things and making sure that you're staying connected online as much as possible, whether that's through social media, whether that's through YouTube. They're the churches that I think are going to thrive when things, quote unquote, go back to normal, because they're already going to have the digital platforms in place. The physical stuff is just going to come along, and it's just going to enhance everything that they're already doing.
Dave, as always, this has been so rich. Anything else you want to share before we sign off?
Yeah, I would just be encouraging. I would love to encourage all the pastors out there who are feeling the pressure of going online and feeling that pressure of constantly being on, because that's what the modern world is with social media and online. And Carey, you've talked about this, I've talked about this, and because we've both experienced, what burnout looks like. I just want to encourage all the pastors out there. Hey, this doesn't take a whole lot of things. You can connect with your people online while you're walking your dog in the evenings. Like, do things like that. Take small steps like that, rather than think you have to have a worldwide platform with great production, all those sorts of things. Don't worry about those things. Take care of the people who are in your neighborhood, the neighborhood you've been called to. Take care of them first and connect with them first digitally, and guard your own heart. Put up boundaries around your own life. Carey, you've been somebody who has really encouraged me in this area and helped get me through a really dark time when I was feeling burned out. And so I would just encourage people to do exactly the same thing. Follow the advice you always give. Make sure you're taking breaks. Make sure you're giving yourself a day of rest, and make sure you're recharging your own batteries.
Yeah, and don't charge your phone in your bedroom. My phone charges down here, and I put it to bed every night, and I pick it up in the morning, and you're human. Right.
Yeah,
so I think that's really good advice. And the other thing, you and I've talked about this too, is the internet doesn't lie, and it gives you real-time feedback. Try a bunch of stuff. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And eventually you'll stumble into some stuff that does, and it can be amazing. Dave, thank you so much for joining with us. I really appreciate the way you build into church leaders, and excited about your work with Orange and the next generation as well. For everybody watching today, for those of you who are listening, thank you so much. Make sure you check out everything over at barnaaccess.com. And if you want to learn a little bit more about hybrid church or omni-channel church, you can sign up for the Leading Hybrid Church Barna Collab. It's a 6-week adventure that you can go on where you learn some things about hybrid church in the future. You can go to barna.com/collab and use the promo code ChurchPulse15 to get a discount. If you're listening, please leave a rating and review. We love being able to do this with you. Thank you so much, leaders. We're in your corner, and we'll catch you next time on Church Pulse.